I'm going to start by defining a couple of terms that I use in the title for the talk, Restoring Biodiversity in Suburban London. Biodiversity, I think we all have a reasonable idea probably of what is meant by biodiversity, but this is a commonly accepted definition. Biodiversity describes every living organism within a single ecosystem or habitat, and it has two dimensions to it. One is the diversity of species, the number of species that are found in that ecosystem, in that location, and the numbers of any particular species, or in other words, the abundance, how common is any given species. So those are the two basic dimensions of biodiversity. And you know probably as well as anyone that globally we've been going through a biodiversity crisis for many years, and things are getting worse in two respects. Firstly, an increasing number of species are becoming extinct, and secondly, the populations of species that haven't become extinct, most of them have reduced significantly. And that's the global picture. And at the UK level, things are bad because the UK is one of the most nature depleted countries in the world, and things continue to get worse here. And we see a lot of publicity and newspaper articles and TV clips about the global dimension of it. Another converse of the term biodiversity crisis is the age of extinction, with that so many animals becoming extinct, a typically large number, and as I said, large proportions of other populations disappearing. So here's another headline from last year based on a World Wildlife Fund report, System in Peril. So that's the global level, and that's where I see most publicity, global, international. Now, some people might say, well, so what? And I think there are three main arguments why we should be very concerned about the biodiversity crisis. One is that many of the species found in the world provide vital services to us. And I think a good example of that is pollinating insects, which pollinate about 3/4 of the different kinds of crops that we grow to provide food for ourselves, basically the fruit and vegetable crops. So without their services, we would not be producing the food that we require. A second reason why we should care is that in the last decade or two, an increasing amount of research has shown the importance of nature, of communing with nature for our mental well-being. And there is some research that suggests that the more biodiverse the area where we're communing, the more effective it is in improving our mental well-being. So in other words, if, for example, you were sitting in a park on a park bench, gazing out over some football pitches, that might be nice to be out in a big green open space, but not as beneficial for your well-being as sitting in a woodland and listening to birds singing and seeing the odd squirrel and perhaps fox running around. And the third reason why we should be concerned is that I think, and I think maybe quite a few of you think, that we as the human race have a moral responsibility for the state of our planet Earth, spaceship Earth, and that really it's important that we keep it in as good a shape as possible, including in terms of biodiversity. The second term I want to define is what I mean by suburban London, and I'll start by reference to Greater London. So Greater London is the county that we all live in, and it's often disaggregated into two parts, outer London and inner London. And the pink area here is outer London, and the red area is inner London. Altogether, there are about, I think, 32 boroughs in London, so that's what the black lines are showing, the boundaries of the different boroughs. And tonight, I'm focusing on inner London, which we can see in more detail here. Newham is technically not part of inner London, but would like to be part of inner London. The blue area at the top right there. Anyway, there are 12 boroughs in inner London if we exclude Newham. There's 7 north of the river and 5 south of the river. And I'm saying, for purposes of my definition of suburban London, it equates to inner London. And one thing about inner London that you might not know is this is the area that this group is responsible for, RSPB Central London Local Group, which is why there are often guided walks in different boroughs that you see in that map of inner London. Well, before I can really get into restoring biodiversity, I've got to say something about what biodiversity we have lost. I've been living in inner London for nearly 50 years now, in the borough of Lambeth. And I'm going to talk a bit about my own experience, things that I've noticed that used to be around and have either disappeared altogether or whose numbers have dwindled greatly during that time. And I've spoken with other people who've lived in Southwark for a similar length of time and got their recollections of how things were and how things have changed. And it's very broadly similar to what I'm going to be telling you. And the first species I want to mention is the hedgehog. I've seen 3 hedgehogs in Britain, and 2 of them were in Lambeth. And the first one was in the sort of late 70s when I lived in Gypsy Hill, and there was one in the back garden, or more specifically when I opened the back door one night to empty the food waste into the compost bin. There was a hedgehog in the compost bin. It somehow climbed, well, a compost bucket rather, it somehow climbed up the bucket and into it. And then about 4 years later, I saw another hedgehog in Herne Hill, where I lived at that time, in somebody's front garden one night. And then that was about 82. I've talked with many people who've had sightings of hedgehogs in this general area, about when their sightings were and when their last sighting was. And it's the same story. Basically, the hedgehogs disappeared from most of Lambeth and most of Southwark by the mid-1980s. There are still a few left in both boroughs. Another species which I used to see every year was the house martin. And the park where I have been living until very recently, next to Brockwell Park, was where I used to see them. They nested on the other side of the park on numerous houses there under the eaves, and they would spend a lot of their time flying around over the park. And at one time, in fact, they even nested in the park. And then their numbers gradually diminished over time until 2014. That was when the last pair bred in the area, and they haven't bred there since. And it's similar experience in Dulwich, for example, in the borough of Southwark, and I think more generally in London. Another bird that hasn't disappeared yet altogether, but whose numbers have dwindled greatly, is the swift. I used to see about 20 or 30 of these flying around at any given time on a summer's evening or late spring evening. And now, typically it's more like 3 or 4. Or sometimes you just look up at a broad expanse of sky and you can't see or hear any swifts. They have greatly diminished in number. And here's a third example of a bird that was common at one time in Greater London and used to breed in Inner London, and that is the spotted flycatcher. Now, I've never actually seen one in Inner London, but I did see them when I lived in Croydon in the early 1970s. They were breeding there. I used to go to a churchyard on a summer's evening and watch them, where they would use the gravestones as their perches for launching themselves into the air to catch insects. And it seems that was around the time when the population started declining in a significant way. So as I say, I've never seen them myself in Inner London, but I'm told that they were breeding, for example, in Sydenham Hill Wood until about 1990. By 2009, there were only 6 breeding pairs in the whole of Greater London. I don't know exactly what the situation is now, but I imagine there are less than that, if any, still surviving. Well, why have these species disappeared? I think for any one species, there's usually a combination of factors that account for its depopulation or decline in numbers. And those factors may vary in importance from one species to another. So I'm not saying that all 3 of these species of birds and the hedgehog have all declined exactly for the same reasons, but one thing that is common to all of them is that they all feed on insects, particularly the 3 bird species. Insects account for all, or at least part of their diet. In the case of the hedgehog, it has a much more varied diet, earthworms, for example, but insects are part of the hedgehog diet in the form of beetles and caterpillars. So what's been happening to insects? Could that be the key? Well, this is a headline on the Natural History Museum's website from spring 2022. UK fly insects declined by 60% in 20 years. This is national data, obviously, because I haven't seen any data, equivalent data for Greater London or Inner London. This is based on a survey that was 2 surveys. Well, there was a baseline survey carried out in 2004, and since then there's been an annual survey using the same methodology, so we can compare what happens each year now with what the situation was in 2004, and that's the basis for that headline. Since that annual survey, there's been another 1 or 2, and the next slide I show you is based on the most recent annual survey, which I think was done in 2023. So that first column, or histogram, the all blue one, depicts that the 2004 number of insects was 100%. That's the baseline, 100%. And then we can compare the 2023 data. The blue part of that second column tells us that the number of insects counted in 2023 was only 17% of the long blue line in 2004. Conversely, that orange bar represents the 83% that disappeared in 20 years or less. 83%, I find that horrific. A very drastic decline. Now, for Greater London, Inner London, it's not necessarily exactly like that, but I think we can assume if the national decline has been that great, there's definitely been some decline in insect numbers in London as well. If we look at particular types of insect, butterflies are one of the ones that have been monitored most because they're so attractive. They attract our attention and people like to record them. And the situation for butterflies is that about 80% of our butterfly species have decreased in abundance or distribution or both since the 1970s. And half of the species are listed as threatened or near threatened. If we look at there's another survey done by the Butterfly Conservation Society, and some of you may have participated in it. It's a citizen science survey, which they run every summer. At least I think many of you will be aware of it. And they've been doing that for about 15 years now. And last year, the data collected showed that butterfly numbers nationally were at their lowest level since this survey began. And that prompted Butterfly Conservation to declare a butterfly emergency. Moving on to bumblebees, in Britain, between 1960 and 2012, the geographic ranges of more than half of our bumble species declined by more than half. And in addition, 2 bumble species went extinct during that period. So we can see that insect numbers have declined, illustrated more specifically by butterflies and bumblebees. Why have they declined? This is a bit like peeling the layers of the onion, I think. And basically, researchers have identified 3 broad factors behind it, the decline: habitat loss, pesticides, climate change. Now, the relative importance of these factors, I think, will vary depending on whether we're in a rural area or an urban area, depending on whether we're in an agricultural area or not. I think where there's dominant intensive agriculture, as in some parts of the country, pesticides are likely to be the main reason for the decline. In urban areas, fortunately, pesticides are used a lot less, and habitat loss, I think, is the major factor in urban areas. Certainly that seems to be the case for the borough of Lambeth, where I live. There's a quote here from a Lambeth Council document, the Lambeth Pollinator Action Plan, which identifies the most significant cause of decline in pollinating insects in particular as the loss and degradation of habitats. And it goes on to note that the loss of wildflower-rich grasslands is one of the most important issues. Well, how have we lost this habitat that's so important for insects? Well, we built on a lot of green space that we used to have. We built more houses, more offices, more schools, more roads, and so on. So there's a lot less green space around than there used to be. The factor is what's been happening in our gardens. London's gardens make up almost a quarter of the land area of the capital. That's inner and outer London. And they've been changing from green to grey. Well, what does that mean? I think you can guess. We've all noticed it happening. Front gardens get paved over often to create spaces for car parking or to make the garden a bit more easy to manage. Back gardens get lost under patios or decking, or people building garden offices at the back so that they can work at home rather than going into the office. And then another factor has been people switching from natural grass lawns to artificial grass lawns. I was on Facebook this morning, someone I know just saying, our grass lawn's been a real pain. We've just installed artificial grass. And that has happened in a lot of gardens. So here, in this graph, I've just summarised in a very broad sense, on the left-hand side of the graph, what the decline that I've just been talking about. That blue line represents a decline in biodiversity over the last 40 or 50 years. The right-hand side of the graph is looking to the future, the next 25 years through to 2050. What is going to happen? What could happen? I've put in 2 scenarios. The one represented by the orange line shows basically a continuation of what we've been experiencing in the last half century. Ongoing decline, what some people might call a business as usual scenario. The other line is very different. The grey line is what I call a reversal line, and assumes that the decline in biodiversity doesn't continue any longer. In fact, it comes to a halt and goes into reverse, and we start increasing the amount of biodiversity, restoring some of what we lost in the last few decades. So those are just illustrative scenarios to represent two different potential outcomes. Now, if you were a betting person, you would probably put your money on the continuation scenario, the business as usual scenario. And maybe that is more likely, but imagine what that would be like come 2050 for our children and our children's children, if that's what happens, if we have a continuation of the decline in biodiversity. Even less insects and birds and flowers than we have today. We don't have as much bird song as we used to have. I don't hear so many song thrushes and missel thrushes singing these days, but in 25 years' time, they may have gone altogether, the blackbirds may have gone, we might just have the odd robin singing or great tit calling. Seeing a butterfly might be a really exceptional experience, and the same for bumblebees. Can we really allow that to happen? Well, I've given a rather gloomy picture so far of what has been happening, and I think it's about time I changed my tone. And as we look into the future, I want to present a more optimistic picture, because I believe that we can reverse things, like we can reverse the decline in biodiversity. I'm not saying it'll be easy, I don't think it will be easy, but one bit of good news is that the campaign has already begun, and there's already a lot starting to happen. This quote from Sir David Attenborough, I think, is one we should bear in mind. We've got less green space than we had before, so we've really got to make the most of what is left in terms of boosting its biodiversity. And the kind of locations where biodiversity needs to be improved range from the larger parks and green spaces and churchyards and cemeteries through to much smaller areas like road verges and gardens. And a whole range of stakeholders need to be actively involved in this. We can't just leave it to our local authorities. Voluntary organisations have an important role to play. So do citizens, like you and me, and other organisations. And a basic characteristic of the approach that I'm advocating is starting at the bottom and working up. A bottom-up approach is what I call it. And I think that this ecological pyramid diagram is helpful in illustrating what I mean by that. It's got 5 layers. At the bottom it is what it calls the producers layer. This is basically the flora, which provide the foundation for the rest of the ecosystems. So that includes trees, grasses, flowering plants and crops. The next level up, primary consumers or invertebrates, includes the insects and various other invertebrates like ants and earthworms. And then the third level up is secondary consumers of the floristic produce. So these are basically small vertebrates illustrated in the diagram by rats, sparrows and frogs. So these may either consume primary consumers, invertebrates from the level below, like butterflies, for example, may be consumed by a flycatcher. Or, as in the case of the sparrow, they might feed directly on seeds from the bottom level. But in both cases, we can see that bottom light blue level is the foundation of the pyramid and supporting the higher levels. In this talk, I'm going to have to focus. I can't talk about everything. So at level 1, I'm going to focus on wildflowers to illustrate the point. Level 2, invertebrates, I'm going to focus on pollinating insects. And level 3, the secondary consumers or small vertebrates, I'm going to focus on hedgehogs. Now, if we look in a local park, what do we see? What's the predominant habitat? Well, this photo shows a large area of amenity grassland with some trees dotted on it. And this could be any park in suburban London practically. Happens to be Brockwell Park in Lambeth, but most parks have these large expanses of amenity grassland, excuse me, which, because their biodiversity is so low, are sometimes described as green deserts. And what we need to do is convert some of those low biodiversity areas into wildflower-rich areas. And this is something that's already underway, fortunately. Most local authorities, such as Southwark and Lambeth, are already replacing some of their amenity grassland and creating wildflower meadows. And these meadows can be all shapes and sizes. They can be large or small. They can be round or square. They take a variety of forms, and I'll show you some examples in a minute. One important thing is that any wildflower meadow should have a wide variety of plant species in it, and preferably primarily native plant species, something like 20 to 30, for example. They are created usually by applying a seed mix that contains seeds of such a variety of species. And one of the reasons why it's important to have a wide range of species is that we need to provide nectar for the pollinating insects for a period of at least 6 months, because some insects will come out in the early spring, others will be out in the summer, and others will be requiring nectar in the autumn. So we need a range of plants that can be flowering at different times during the season. Another reason why we need a variety of plants is that some pollinating insects, or more specifically their caterpillars, require very specific food plants. They're very fussy. So if, for example, we want to see common blue butterflies, we need to have some bird's foot trefoil, because that's the one plant that their caterpillars will eat. Similarly, if we want to see small copper butterflies, we need to provide sorrel for them. I'm going to give examples from these two boroughs, Southwark and Lambeth, 2 examples from each, starting with Burgess Park. Some of you will have been here with our SPB Central London local group, because we do a walk here every year at the end of January, but we don't cover this part of the park. Basically, what this photo is showing is a large mound, which is one of 3 large mounds created by the council. And then the seeds were sown over the mounds, and you can see that there's a lot of vegetation on the slopes, because what happens is that people don't walk around on the slopes. They walk around at the bottom like the woman in the photo, or they walk along the top or jog along the top. So these side areas remain intact, and there's been a wide variety of species growing on 3 large mounds in that park. Another Southwark park with wildflower meadows is Dulwich Park, which has 3 or 4 small areas. This is one with a small wooden fence around it. Here's another one. You can't actually see the wildflowers here, but if you enter through that gate, it's a wildflower meadow on your right. The reason why you can't see them is that This photo was taken in mid-August, and the council has just cut the meadow and removed them. Moving into Lambeth, there are 3 wildflower meadows that have been created on Clapham Common. This is one of them. The council has had some involvement, but most of the work has been done by a newly formed 2 or 3 years ago, voluntary organisation called Wild Clapham, which Alison mentioned when introducing me, because during a few months ago, I've become involved with Wild Clapham as a member of their advisory committee. So I will say a bit about it, Alison. Basically, it was formed by friends of Clapham Common and the Clapham Society to pursue biodiversity work for Clapham Common and surrounding areas. So basically, Wild Clapham aims to increase biodiversity and to improve climate resilience on the common and adjacent areas. Moving into Lambeth, second site, this is Brockwell Park. I call this wildflower meadow Meadow 1 for reasons that I'll explain in a minute. So this one was created in 2019, and this is early spring, so the flowers are just starting to come through, and it's surrounded by a hedgerow as well, which you can see. The year before last, I organised a count of the number of plant species in this in this wildflower meadow, and the team counted 54 species of plants in that area, which is not bad. Now, this is another wildflower meadow in Brockwell Park, Meadow 2. This was created by the council a year ago. They sowed the seeds then, and this is what the meadow looked like in July last year, so you can see lots of flowers have come through. And this is what the meadow looked like in October last year, when things have dried out and they're dying off. The main significance of this slide is the volunteers you can see in the picture there, who are planting additional plants, plug plants, in addition to the ones that have already come up from the seed mix. And the point is that it's not just a council initiative, but it has the cooperation of a voluntary organisation, the Friends of Brockwell Park. But this is the council's ecologist supervising everybody while taking it easy himself. So that was parks mainly. I'm just going to say a bit about cemeteries, because they too can be important for wildflower-rich areas. And I'm going to mention 3 which fit the bill there. Brompton in Kensington and Chelsea, Margravine in Hammersmith and Fulham, and Tower Hamlets Cemetery Park in Tower Hamlets. These are actually 3 cemeteries where the group has had guided bird walks, because they're reasonably good for birds. Margravine and Tower Hamlets both have very active Friends of groups, Friends of Margravine Cemetery, Friends of Tower Hamlets. And so they've been involved in promoting wildflower-rich areas in these cemeteries. Brompton is managed by the Royal Parks, who have staff with ecological responsibilities, so they look after that aspect of things for that cemetery. I'm just going to say a bit more about Brompton. I visited it for the first time last summer on a guided pollinator walk, which was interesting. But the habitats there, they don't have a big wildflower meadow like the ones I showed in some of the parks, but they have small patches, a mosaic of patches of flower-rich grassland, small meadows, and wilder areas of scrub composed of brambles and hawthorns and so on. And they have, as I was saying, a variety of wildflowers. For example, in this case, lady's bedstraw, bird's foot trefoil, and oxeye daisies. So what happens when you create these wildflower meadows? You get lots of wildflowers, obviously. But what do they do for insects? Well, I'm glad to say that they seem to work in terms of supporting insects. There are a lot of what I call spontaneous colonizers, species that move in without any direct support from humans. They become aware of the new favourable habitat and the fact that there's nectar to be had there or other food, and they just gradually move in over time. And I'm going to give you examples of some of the pollinating insects. Well, these are the different categories of pollinating insects. Butterflies are well known, and bumblebees and honeybees. Solitary bees are also important, and there are a lot more solitary bee species than there are bumblebees. Moths are important. Of course, we tend to forget them since they're mainly nocturnal, but whereas we've only got 50 odd species of butterflies, we've got 2,500 species of moths. Wasps are important, flies, and flies, that includes hoverflies, 270 species of hoverflies. Some beetles are also pollinators, about 1,000 species of beetles. So that gives us about 4,000 species altogether in Britain as a whole that provide a pollination role. These are some of the species that I've recorded in Wildflower Meadow 1 in Brockwell Park. Starting with butterflies, I've seen 11 species of butterflies there. These are examples. The large skipper, and there's two other skippers as well, the small and Essex skippers. Common blue butterfly, small white, and gatekeeper. There's some of the 11 that I've seen. Moths. As I said, it's easy to forget moths, and we tend not to see them. So I organised a moth trapping exercise. The black box you can see in the picture on the left is a moth trap. It's quite small. When you put egg trays in, and then the moths can feel comfortable sort of hiding away in nooks and crannies there. And we counted the next morning 17 species of moths in the trap, 63 moths altogether. If you did this exercise once a month for 6 or 8 months, you'd attract different species at different times of the year, and I wouldn't be surprised if the number of moth species recorded was over 100. In Brompton Cemetery, they've recorded over 200 species of moths. Some examples, there was one there, Vines rustic, straw underwing on the left, orange sallow on the right. Bumblebees, I've seen 5 species there. A fairly common one is the common carder. A much less common one, which I've only seen there once, is the one on the right, the southern cuckoo bumblebee. Hoverflies, I've seen 4 species. Some of the hoverfly names are quite good, I think. The Batman hoverfly, because it has a Batman logo in its markings, and the marmalade hoverfly. And finally, beetles, the one on the left, a kind of flower beetle, doesn't have an English name. And of course, ladybirds, which can also provide a pollination function sometimes. So, in terms of spontaneous colonisation, there's a lot of insects moved in, which is great, it's very positive. But on the other hand, there are, I think, many animals that haven't moved into these meadows that could make good use of them. An example being the hedgehog. So the Wildflower Meadow 1 in Brockwell Park and that surrounding area of hedgerow and bushes could be good hedgehog habitat, but there aren't any hedgehogs there. And why is that? It's because with all the green space that we've lost over the last half century, what's left of biodiverse habitats is fragmented on the whole, scattered, as you can see from this map, with sometimes with significant distances between one biodiverse habitat and the next. And fragmentation has a negative impact. It means that, as I was saying, some species that could benefit from the newly created biodiverse areas haven't been able to move in, haven't been able to travel there. If you think about it, the examples I gave, they're all flying insects. They can all fly a few miles without much difficulty to colonize a new area. But if you're an animal that travels by land, it's much more difficult. You may have to cross roads and risk getting run over, or you may expose yourself to predators like cats or foxes, for example. And so we have these isolated populations of some species, like the hedgehog, and because they're isolated, there's no interbreeding between that population and another population. The breeding is all within the small isolated population, and that results in a loss of genetic diversity, which in turn increases the risk of that species becoming extinct in that locality. Hedgehogs, yeah. According to the London Wildlife Trust, the hedgehog population in London declined by nearly a third since 2000. And loss of habitat seems to be a major factor, and disturbance by high human populations. This is a map of sightings of hedgehogs in 2018. I don't know whether you can see a thin orange circle, but that very roughly corresponds to inner London. And the big pink blobs are locations where there have been a number of sightings of hedgehogs. So one of those two central ones close to the river would be Regent's Park, where there's a remaining population of hedgehogs. And those little blue dots, the very small ones, are where there's only been one or two sightings. So what do we do about that? Well, it's important to create corridors, wildlife corridors, that can link these different bits of habitat to each other, and hence the populations to each other. That would facilitate the movement of animals, particularly land or terrestrial walking animals, from one site where they currently exist into a new site that's being created and is suitable for them. And it would also facilitate interbreeding between different populations and increase the genetic diversity. There's different kinds of corridors. I'm going to focus on what are called beelines, and these have been pioneered and promoted by the charity Bug Life. So think of beelines as bug lines, if you like, and included in those bugs are the pollinating insects, which I'm focusing on this evening. But they can also be useful, as I suggested earlier, for other animals, not just for pollinating insects. Now, you may not know it, and I didn't until a couple of years ago, but every county in Britain has had 2 beelines designated in it, a north-south one and an east-west one, by scientists who are trying to do, and this is the national network. I'll just show you a specific example for Greater London. So this is the north-south beeline for Greater London, that pale yellow line. What they're trying to do is, in making these designations, is to identify continuous lines of places which are relatively well endowed with biodiversity-rich areas, and therefore hold the greatest promise for providing a continuous route through which insects can travel from A to B, B to C, C to D, and so on. Now these aren't perfect by any means, but they represent a good start. I'll show you a smaller area of this beeline here. this is the part of that beeline that runs through Lambeth. The white line you see is the Lambeth border, running from the northern tip by the River Thames, where you have Lambeth Palace and St Thomas's Hospital, right down through Kennington, Yeovil, Brixton, Streatham, and then the line swerves off to the right into Southwark. And each line is 3 kilometres wide, just so you get a feel for it. London has an east-west line, and that was designated, the designation was only completed relatively recently. So that's that amber-looking line that you see along with all the green lines. So that cuts across, and you can see that it crosses the north-south beeline at one point and overlaps with it. And this is where the two lines meet. So the blue circle that you can see on the beeline near the middle of the map is Brixton. Bit of green just south and east of Brixton is Brockwell Park, which I was talking about earlier. A bit of greenery just east of there is Dulwich Park, which I also talked about earlier. If you go west from the junction, it takes you to Balham and on towards Wimbledon. If you go east, you're going to Forest Hill and Sydenham. Now, Britain has a national pollinator action plan, and many local authorities have adopted their own or created their own pollinator action plans, and Lambeth is one of them. And Lambeth's plan links up with these beelines. So basically, Lambeth's aiming to increase and enhance the amount of pollinator habitat, and particularly along the beelines, where, as I said, there are already promising areas, but it's a matter of strengthening the beelines, creating new habitats that will link and support the existing ones. So the two wildflower meadows in Brockwell Park that I mentioned are contributing to strengthening that London north-south beeline. And as it says in the second paragraph, the aim is to restore and create wildflower-rich habitat stepping stones along the entire beelines network. Now, stepping stones are an important component of beelines, so let me say a bit more about that. So this diagram, we've got two diagrams here, illustrating top left, bottom right in each. The bigger green area is a well-established, highly biodiverse area. In the diagram on the left, there are 4 stepping stones, patches of land also of high biodiversity value, that can provide a corridor from one of the big green spaces to the other, so that the species represented by the black dots can move from one to the other. Whereas the diagram on the right shows there's a critical gap at one point in that chain, where it would be desirable to create a new stepping stone to fill the gap. Lambeth Council has a project called Lambeth Bee Roads, and that's really about creating stepping stones with particular reference to roads, so roadside verges and roundabouts, for example. And they've been doing this across the borough. So here's an example of a wildflower-rich road verge that they've created. And they've created about 40 of these altogether across the borough from north to south. So each of those is represented by a blue pin in this map. So these can be potentially valuable stepping stones in the beeline, north-south beeline. Another thing that local authorities are doing, some of them anyway, is no-mow, or cutting grass less often. So this is a Lambeth Council sign on a housing estate saying we're letting the grass grow longer. That's also good for supporting pollinating insects. I've talked a lot about councils. I've mentioned voluntary organisations like Wild Clapham and some friends of groups, but another voluntary organisation that's working on creating biodiverse spaces in Lambeth and other London boroughs is Incredible Edible. So as their name suggests, they have a focus on food production, but they're also working with residents of housing estates, people who don't have their own gardens, on creating biodiverse areas on the housing estate land. And finally, there is the public, us guys. We could also make a valuable contribution to the beelines by creating lots of small stepping stones. Gardens can be very valuable sources of nectar and food plants for pollinators, and can attract many species. This is an example of a large garden in Dulwich where the owner has planted a kind of green sward. It wasn't just grass, it contained a variety of plant species as well. And they've cut the lawn in partly and left some patches, as you can see, for the flowers to grow taller. And so a variety of wildflower species are flourishing in this garden. But not everybody has a big garden like that. But even small areas, just 4 square metres of mini meadows, if you like, which have been seeded with a variety of wildflowers, can make a significant difference. So research by Sussex University found that if you just create 4 square metres of wildflower-rich habitat in a garden, then the following year, after sowing the seeds, the mini meadows created attract roughly about twice as many bumblebees, solitary bees and solitary wasps as control plots where no wildflowers were sown. It's both the abundance and the diversity of the species that increased. If you haven't got room in your garden, you may be able to create a wildflower-rich area on a roof, like this one in East Dulwich, a house roof, or on a shed roof, like this one. And if, like many people in London, you don't have a garden, perhaps live in a block of flats, you can still make a small contribution by planting wildflowers in pots or window boxes on your windowsill or on your balcony if you have one. And even on higher floors, you find that insects get attracted to the nectar available. So, in summary, what we need to do is to stop the destruction and degradation that has been going on, and protect our remaining green spaces. And, I haven't had time to talk about that, but for example, in Lambeth, voluntary organisations are gearing up for a battle with the council, which wants to build 3 large flood-lit football pitches, artificial football pitches, one on Clapham Common, one in Brockwell Park, and one in another park. So, and ironically, the one in Brockwell Park would cover half of the Wildflower Meadow 1 that I've been talking about a lot. So that needs to be focused on, and in addition we need to be maximising biodiversity, as I've been saying, of all the spaces in our parks and cemeteries and the smaller spaces along roads and in gardens. And finally, we need to create wildflower corridors to link up the biodiversity-rich areas. So referring back to the graph that I showed earlier, I don't think it's inevitable that we'll have a continuation of what has been happening. I do believe it's possible, and I hope I've persuaded and convinced you it's possible to reverse the decline that's been happening and to actually start to increase our biodiversity again. And I think and hope that we can turn suburban London into a network of colourful, insect-friendly and wildflower-rich habitats that support a wide variety of other species as well, including the birds that we all love, and mammals and all sorts of other wildlife. And that's it. Thank you.